WNST. Took a little pass this week. I called an audible and I said, I don't really feel like spending 3.5 days in Indianapolis this week, so I'm not. So I'm back in the home studio, hanging out, doing our thing, watching the Orioles as well as the Caps, the Terps, the Wizards. Plenty of things going on. Gary Davenport, however, is also monitoring all things in Indianapolis live via satellite. You can follow his journey out at Bleacher Report as well as at IDP Sharks out on Twitter. Welcome back, Gary, one of our defending champions around here as this combine gets going and as we play out this draft over the next 6 or 7 weeks. Certainly for every corner of the NFL, even up in New England where all they do is win championships, there's still plenty of work to be done here in the offseason, and it really does begin with the cuts this week and free agency next week.
Oh, yeah, we've already seen the cuts start to happen as teams try to free up cap room. We saw several teams break out the always popular franchise tag yesterday. And then, of course, starting today in Indianapolis, we have the Underwear Olympics, everyone's favorite event.
Well, and for every team out there are question marks. For the Ravens, which is where we reside here, Gary, this is as strange an offseason as we're going to have because I don't feel like the cupboard is empty, but it certainly is not closer to full than empty. I think the record speaks to that. The last 4 years speaks to that. How you replace Steve Smith, how do you replace Zach Orr, what's going to happen with Brandon Williams and Rick Wagner. The Ravens, we could sit here and talk for hours just about their issues, and I'm sure Steve Bisciotti's done that with the brass at this point.
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously not the worst off team in the National Football League talent-wise, but they're not the best off either. Like you said, especially depending on how free agency goes, they could be adding defensive tackle, offensive tackle to a list that already includes, like you said, the Zach Orr thing was certainly a blow from out of nowhere. They didn't expect to have to replace that inside linebacker next to C.J. Mosley in this year's draft. But at least there's not that one just giant looming need that just is in 8-foot tall lit up letters. You have to get a fill in the blank. So we know what Ozzie Newsome's going to do. He's going to go out there and get the best player available. It might not be the first round pick might not be spent on that position you think is the biggest need for the Ravens, but Ozzie, in his years as a general manager, has earned a certain amount of slack from plans because he usually drafts well, and I don't expect this year to be any different.
Well, and in the case of the Ravens and the needs that they're going to have, this free agency market, and I know you've been tweeting a lot about the Cleveland Browns. You're out in that part of the world and the amount of cap space they have. This was similar to last year with Jacksonville and Oakland. And look, the Ravens lost Kelechi Assembly not because they didn't like him or they didn't have a spot for him. A, they didn't have the money, and B, he got outrageous money. And the way the cap has gone north and the way the Ravens always sort of play to the cap with veteran players, this is where, when the Elvis Dumervilles don't pan out and, when you can't get Dennis Pitt on the field and you move Ladarius Webb to a safety position and still paying him like a corner and you can't get Jimmy Smith on the field, this is where the money starts to add up on the veteran players. And for the really bad teams out there, this is their week to go shopping and see who they can lure into being the next version of the Cleveland Browns.
Well, absolutely. You look at the two teams with the most cap space in the National Football League, you're talking about the Cleveland Browns and the San Francisco 49ers, which are probably the two most talent-deficient teams in the National Football League. The problem is, with a precious few exceptions, last year's New York Giants were able to have quite a bit of success going out and retooling their defense in free agency. But more often than not, when we see these teams go out and just spend like a drunken sailor in free, it doesn't work out. Every time we hear about a so-called dream team, 2 years later they wind up blowing it up. And you're going to have to spend big this year. There's over $1 billion in salary cap space out there floating around between the 32 teams in the NFL. And we're already seeing, teams aren't hesitating to throw the franchise tag on. We saw the Giants tag Jason Pierre-Paul. They've now got over $40 million in cap space tied up in just 3 defensive line starters. So, we've already seen the pass rushers have already been decimated before free agency even starts. If you want offensive line help, Ricky Wagner is going to get a big contract. Kevin Zeitler, the guard for the Bengals, is going to get a big contract from somewhere. So if you want to address your team through free agency, you had better be prepared to spend a lot of money to do it. Whereas if you're going to upgrade on the cheap, that's what the draft's for with this new rookie wage scale, and you get these cheap contracts for 4, maybe 5 years in the case of first rounders. That's how you're going to build your team up if you don't have a lot of cap space to play with.
For these dregs of the league like Cleveland and San Francisco, the Bears are all going to be drafting high. John Lynch is the most I saw him at one point in Houston at the Super Bowl, and he had people gathered around him and whatnot, and I'm thinking, man, oh man, to go sit in that seat at this point with that team and a lot of money, and the fan confidence isn't there, but not a lot of players right now either, and not a lot of experience for him. This top of the draft, and whether they decide to go with quarterbacks up there, whether they decide to go pass rusher, which I think a lot of folks think the Browns are going to do at the top of the draft, this is a tender time for those organizations to say, what kind of an executive is John Lynch going to be? I know everyone fancies him the next John Elway. Time will tell.
Oh, yeah, there are a few decisions he's going to have to make right out of the gate. They're going to set the tone for whether his tenure in San Francisco lasts 10 years or 2. There's already rumblings of Kirk Cousins possibly that the 49ers could take a run at him, in which case that's going to cost you probably at least a first-round pick. Not to mention the $20 million per year contract you're going to have to give to Cousins.
$24 million. I did the math on that. It's insane. I mean, when Kirk Cousins is getting $24 million, wow, right?
Yeah, and I think the NFL's a better place when teams like the Oakland Raiders, San Francisco 49ers, teams that have a lot of history, are good. It helps the league as a whole.
Well, as long as they're not 2-14, right? I mean, where those franchises have been over the last 15 years, mainly down. I would agree with you. It's not just about. It's about competing. I mean, we haven't seen that from the Browns for as long as they've been back in the league, and we're working on 2 decades now.
Right, but and this is coming from a Cleveland Browns fan. How long has it been since the Browns really were good? I mean, they had a nice little run in the '80s, and then before that, you got to go all the way back to the mid '60s and the years of Jim Brown. So it's not like it's a huge stunner for Browns fans. And given that they're not, or at least reportedly not going to franchise tag Terrell Pryor, it appears that they are bound and determined to just stay in the basement. So I try not to let myself get too frustrated. But yeah, Lynch is. There's not a lot of room for error. I know the 49ers have a ton of cap space. I know they have the number 2 overall pick in the 2017 draft, but they also have, that's probably the most talent-deficient team in the National Football. It's not a matter of which position they have a need at. It's a matter of which position they don't have a need at. So if they're going to turn that thing around with any kind of speed, I mean, we're talking a 2 or 3 year rebuild, even if they do everything right, would be my guess. If he's going to turn around, you just can't miss. You can't miss on the big money signings. You can't miss on draft picks. And it's not a lot of margin for error for a guy who's never done anything like this before.
He is Gary Davenport. He covers all things NFL out of Bleach Report. You can follow his journey out on Twitter at IDP Sharks, excuse me. And you did write about John Lynch as well. Some other teams out there like the Panthers that have sort of fallen and can't get up this year. You don't want to say it was an aberration. They certainly have a quarterback who's capable at this point, but I don't think they realize how much they were going to miss Josh Norman. I don't think, when you go 15-1 and you have that level of disappointment, and look, the Falcons are going to have to deal with that this year too. That, the Cowboys are another team. I've talked about that this week. When you win 13 games, there's not a whole lot of oxygen at the top of that tank. You don't necessarily think you're going to win 14 next year.
Yeah, sometimes it can be even harder once you get there to stay there, and certainly Carolina was an object lesson in that this past year. It would appear, at least if their early moves are any indication, that the Panthers feel like maybe last year was a bit more of an aberration than the 15-1 record that came the year before. They seem to be focusing mostly on keeping the guys. They re-upped Wes Horton, they re-upped Mario Addison, slapped the franchise tag on Kawann Short, which I believe just about everyone expected them to do. So my guess would be that Sean McDermott thinks that he can hit that draft hard this year and kind of fill in some of those holes that they have on the roster with some younger, cheaper talent. Like you said, I think the biggest thing for Carolina last year was they just totally underestimated the impact that losing Josh Norman was going to have on that secondary. It went from one of the best secondaries in the NFL to a deeply flawed one, and it killed them, killed their season.
Well, and the same thing can be said for the Ravens when Jimmy Smith wasn't out on the field, when you don't have a corner, and then that brings to light the draft. And who are the corners in this draft? Who are the quarterbacks? And certainly the pass rushers. That this draft is going to be a lot about defense, correct, Gary?
Oh, absolutely. It would appear that those positions, there's a lot of talent at the top of the pass rushers. It seems like the past 4 or 5 years there have been plenty of talent. If you're hurting a cornerback or if you're hurting a wide receiver, those are the positions you want to go into the draft in need of. I don't know that there's that slam dunk quarterback this year. There are a lot of people who like Mitch Trubisky, a few that like Deshaun Kaiser. There are some that like Deshaun Watson, and then you've got some who think Pat Mahomes is the best signal caller in this year's draft. So there's certainly not an Andrew Luck in this year's draft, and it's a shallow crop at offensive tackle. I don't know that there are any slam dunk, blindside, 10-year starters in this year's draft, and it's going to be a weird draft because there's only probably 2 tackles I think are slam dunk first-round picks, and there might be a third, but to only have 3 offensive tackles go in the first round would be almost unheard of.
But will any of them have a marijuana gas mask on draft night? That's the question, right?
I certainly hope not. I would like to think that the young men this year have learned from the missteps of the past, and that was one of the more alarming missteps that we've seen in recent years.
Quarterback's going to be the key, not just to the draft, but between now and draft day. Who is going to have an empty seat? Who's going to have a seat at the table? Where does Jay Cutler go? What happens with Tony Romo, the Garoppolo situation? And a lot of teams out there in need of a quarterback, and teams like the Bears just dying to get rid of the one they already have, right?
Yeah, and the Garoppolo situation, I tend to think he's going to wind up sticking in New England for one more year. I just don't know. It's going to be a matter of a team is going to have to be willing to pay what New England wants. New England is not going to sell him for 60 cents on the dollar. They just won't do it. They'd rather hang on to him for a year and then see what happens. I wouldn't be stunned to see him hang on to him, talk about transition tagging him, and see if they can match whatever offer he gets the year after. I put nothing past Bill Belichick. I don't know that I would want to pay a first-round pick plus for Jimmy Garoppolo. Yes, he played well last year in limited action, but that's the key. It's very limited action. It's going to be very interesting to see where Cutler winds up. I'm just interested to see which teams are really going to pursue him. I don't know that he really fits a team that is quote-unquote rebuilding, because by the time you get the rebuild really underway, Cutler's going to be that much older. Tony Romo, I think that's more or less a 2-horse race. I think he's either going to be playing under center next year for the Houston Texans or the Denver Broncos. And if it does wind up being the Houston Texans, what does that say about Rick Smith's decision to hand $35 million in guaranteed money to Brock Osweiler last year at the start of free agency?
Well, exactly. I mean, this was the time of the year last year where either mistakes were made. And hey, we talk about the Cowboys so many times and, their near misses and their fatal flaws and their problems. They were the one team this time last year that needed to really do well in the draft to really make their way. And 13-3, and I know it was a disappointment they didn't get to Houston, and Jerry didn't get a chance to go for that ring there, but they solved a lot of problems last year through the draft, and that is sort of a model for what teams like the Ravens are trying to do. If the Ravens could just find 2 good starters out of the draft, or 3 good starters, not Ray Lewis and Ed Reed and John Ogden, just really good football players, then you solve some problems, and that's been a big problem here in Baltimore, solving problems through the draft. When I get off a plane from Australia, and the first thing I see is Matt Elam getting arrested for dealing weed. Not only that's a problem, the real problem is he never got on the field through 4 years.
Yeah, that was not the best draft Ozzie Newsome has ever had. I believe that's the same draft that they drafted, Arthur Brown in the second round after Elam. Got 2 guys that were supposed to be cornerstones of their defense for years to come, and nothing came from either one. And it just goes to show a lot of times you just don't know. I mean, I don't know of any draftniks right on the top of my head who didn't think Matt Elam was going to be a starting safety in the NFL for 6, 8, 10 years. It's sometimes these kids don't pan out, and there's just so much pressure now, given the disparity in the contract sizes between what guys get on their rookie deals and what they get once they hit free agency with this sky-high salary cap now. There's just so much pressure on these teams to hit on these draft picks. That's how you're going to turn your team around. Not only is that how you turn your team around, that's how you hold on to your big money guys when they finally do hit free agency, because you have the cap space, the flexibility to be able to pay a guy $15, $20 million a season, because you've got 3 or 4 other starters. They're only making $1 million or $2 million. I mean, that is how the Seattle Seahawks were turned into a perennial contender, was all these low-dollar contracts. And now the bill's starting to come due on some of those players, and we're seeing the Seahawks kind of have to scramble And they decided, the area that they weren't going to put a lot of money into was the offensive line. They have the least amount invested in that unit of any team in the National Football League. And it showed last year. That was their biggest glaring weakness. So in the salary cap era, you're constantly shuffling low-dollar contracts, big-dollar contracts, you're going to have a weakness, but you don't want it to be too glaring a weakness. You want it to be offset by your strength, and it's not easy to be a general manager in today's NFL, and I don't envy John Lynch having to do it with no experience.
It is interesting you mentioned the Matt Elam, Arthur Brown at the top of the 13 draft, and how those guys literally made zero impact on this franchise over the last 4 years, whereas a Brandon Williams and a Rick Wagner make plenty of impact, and now the bill has come due on those guys, and when they hit the market, the amount of money that's going to be out there, as we pointed out, the $1 billion in the industry and all that. But not only that, they drafted John Simon that year, who's running around playing pretty good football for Houston and couldn't get on the field here. So, the draft, when you don't hit in the first and second round, at least if you have third, fourth, fifth round guys that get on the field and play, that's great. But then you got to pay them too.
Yeah, and honestly, that's the story of the 2013 draft. The Ravens are not unique among NFL teams that whiffed at the top of the first couple rounds of the 2013 draft. You look at it now in hindsight, and it's just ouch from the Jeff Fisher pick right on down the line.
Yeah, I gotta go look at that because it really is amazing. And we're talking about all things combine this week and good draft. We always talk about that 83 quarterback draft. Wow, I look back on the 13 thing, man. There were not a lot of good football players in that draft.
No, you had Eric Fisher number one, and this was right about the time of year because at this time of year in 2013, everybody thought Luke Joeckel was going to be the top offensive tackle in the draft, the presumptive number one overall pick. Of course, at this time a year ago, Captain Gas Mask Laramie Tunsil was considered probably the presumptive number one overall prospect headed into the combine. So a lot can change between now and then. But yeah, those two, and both those tackles, Fisher and Joeckel, neither one of them's done a whole lot. Joeckel's hitting free agency this year. The Jaguars moved him inside to guard last year. I think that lasted all of 2 games before he got hurt again. So it's just a bad draft. Most of the NFL talent, the guys who are Pro Bowlers now, that came out of that draft, came out of the end of the second day or the third day of the draft. It's an inexact science. You can scout these guys until you watch tape, until your eyeballs fall out, and there's still no guarantee that once they take the field in the National Football League that they're going to do anything. You just got to hope that you hit more than you miss.
Gary Davenport covers all things NFL at Bleach Report. You can follow him at IDP Sharks out on Twitter as well. Last thing for you, I've talked to everybody about this. The Atlanta Falcons hangover, boy. I don't know what you run into Matt Ryan somewhere around Atlanta. You're just a fan. What do you say to him? You know what I mean? For all of them, I remember pulling out of the parking lot that night in Houston. It feels like a year ago. It was a month ago. And thinking to myself, wow, how do you go home after that?
Yeah, I've been saying it ever since that game happened. I don't know how the Falcons shake that. It's the kind of just brutal, crushing, devastating. They don't have an adjective to describe what that loss would do to it. And it's going to be very interesting to see what they do in 2017, if they can shake that off or if it winds up being the ultimate Super Bowl losers hangover and they struggle this season. I wonder if it's going to follow Kyle Shanahan to San Francisco because, to be frankly honest, he bears his fair share of the responsibility given the offensive play calling in the second half of that football game. So it's going to be interesting to see if that follows him to his new job because, much like John Lynch in San Francisco, Kyle Shanahan doesn't have much margin for error if the 49ers are going to win 4 games.
Hey, man, always great to catch up with you. We will stay in touch. And sorry we're both missing things out in Indianapolis this week, but I'm sure we'll catch up soon.
All right, you have a good one, sir.
You got it. Gary Davenport joining us here from Bleacher Report. You can follow his journey at IDP Sharks out on Twitter. You can find me in the Buy a Toyota audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device. Just download the TuneIn radio app. We do come in crystal clear. The morning newspaper ships to your email inbox at 7 a.m. each and every morning. That's powered up by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com. Still getting you in shape for $10 a month all over the world. That's why it's Planet Fitness. And last but never least, breaking news happens first on the WNST text Flex service. That's brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Of course, Dennis will be here on Thursday driving you home from 3 until 5. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. I'm watching the Caps, the Terps, the Wizards this week, catching up on a little Orioles spring training, and just getting used to normal Eastern Standard Time here, or whatever we're in at this point, and keeping my eyes open. But enjoying reconnecting with everybody here locally, as well as that on our Facebook, our Twitter, our LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram. All the social media tools are there. Still have our trip to London. Still have a few seats available on that. You can throw me an email or just check it out at WNST.net. We'd love to have you join us over in jolly old England, putting some big plans together over there for September. Also going to have road trips for Nashville, Green Bay, Oakland once the schedule comes out next month. So we're looking forward to that. I am headed to the NFL owners meetings in 3 weeks in Phoenix, Arizona. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with the Oakland Raiders over there as well, and their franchise comings and goings. So we'll be monitoring all that as well. I'm Nestor. This is WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore sports.